For 10 years, every time my mother-in-law said something cruel to me, my husband looked at his shoes. Not at her, not at me, at his shoes. As if the right answer were written somewhere down there, on the floor, where he would never have to say it out loud. I used to fill those silences myself. I would laugh, or change the subject, or pretend I had not heard. I became very good at making his mother's unkindness disappear before it could land anywhere, so that no one would ever have to be uncomfortable, so that he would never have to choose. Then came the night of his promotion dinner, his whole firm in one room, his boss 2 seats away, and his mother in her good green dress, deciding that this was the perfect moment to tell everyone what she really thought of me. For 10 years, I had jumped in to soften the blow. I had become a kind of translator, taking the hard things she said and handing the room a gentler version before anyone could flinch. It was the most exhausting job I have ever had, and no one ever knew I was doing it, which is exactly why it worked. That night, for the first time, I set down my glass and I let her keep talking. I want to tell you what happened in that silence, because it changed my marriage and it changed me. There was no secret I was hiding, no trap I had set, no document I was about to slide across the table. The most powerful thing I ever did to that woman was nothing at all. I just stopped protecting her from the sound of her own voice. But to understand why I stayed quiet at the worst possible moment, you have to understand all the times I did not. So let me go back to the beginning. My name is Nora. I am 36 years old, and I work as a physical therapist in a small city in western Michigan. I spend my days helping people learn to trust their own bodies again after an injury, teaching them that the pain they feel is real and worth listening to. It took me a long time to learn that lesson for myself. I married a man named Sean when I was 26. He was gentle and funny and good in all the ways that matter on an ordinary Tuesday. He was also the only son of a widowed mother named Diane, and I did not understand, when I married him, that I was not marrying one person. I was marrying a man and the invisible second wife he had been raised to put first. Before I go on, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Leave your town in the comments. And if you have ever loved a good man who could not, for the life of him, stand up to his own mother, then stay with me, because this story is for you. When Sean and I got engaged, Diane cried. They were not happy tears, though she dressed them up as happy. She held my hands and told me how lucky I was. And then she told me, in the same breath, that Sean had always been sensitive and that I would need to learn how he liked things done. She meant how she liked things done. I just did not have the ears yet to hear the difference. The first thing I gave up before we were even married. I had a chance that year at a job 2 states away. A rehabilitation clinic in Colorado wanted me to help build their program from the ground up. It was the kind of opportunity that comes once. Sean and I talked about it for one evening, and then he talked to his mother, and the next day, the answer was already decided. Diane could not be left alone. Diane had given him everything. Diane would not survive her only son moving across the country. He did not say no to me exactly. He just made it clear that there was no version of our life that did not happen within 20 minutes of his mother's front door. So I turned the job down. I told myself it was love. I told myself that this was what you do for a marriage. You fold your dreams a little smaller so they fit in the space you share. I did not yet understand that I would spend the next 10 years folding, and that the space would never stop shrinking. I want you to understand what that job meant, because it matters later. I grew up the daughter of a woman who never once got to choose her own life. My mother married young, moved where my father's work took her, raised 4 children in towns she did not pick, and set down every ambition she ever had the day she said, "I do." Near the end of her life, she told me one thing, holding my hand in a hospital bed. She told me to build something that was mine, something no one could ask me to give back. That clinic in Colorado was the first thing I had ever been offered that was fully, unmistakably mine. And I handed it back before the ink on my engagement ring was dry, to a family that had not yet decided whether I was worth keeping. I told myself it was love. It would be years before I understood that I had taught Sean and Diane on the very first test exactly how much of me was available to be spent. We bought a house 15 minutes from Diane. She had opinions about it before we had even signed. The kitchen was the wrong color. The neighborhood was beneath us. When we painted the living room a soft gray I had chosen carefully, she stood in the doorway, looked around, and said, "Well, it's certainly a choice." And Sean laughed. He laughed, because that was easier than telling his mother that his wife had good taste. Our wedding should have warned me. Diane took it over piece by piece, always sweetly, always framed as help. She wore ivory, close enough to white that 2 different aunts asked me if it was intentional. During the reception, she stood and gave a long toast about her son, about the bond between a mother and an only boy, about how no woman would ever quite understand him the way she did. People clapped. I smiled in my own wedding dress and felt myself becoming a guest at my own wedding. Afterward, when I told Sean it had stung, he said she was just emotional, that it was a hard day for her, letting go, as if I were a thing being handed from one set of hands to another, and the handoff was the part that hurt her. That became the shape of my marriage. Diane would say something with a smile that was really a small knife, and Sean would laugh, or go quiet, or find a reason to leave the room. And I would be left holding the knife, deciding whether to make a scene or swallow it. I always swallowed it. I told myself that a strong woman does not need her husband to fight her battles. What I did not let myself see was that I was not asking him to fight. I was only asking him to stand next to me, and he could not even do that. I want to be fair to Sean, because this is not a story about a villain. It is a story about a man who was loved in a way that taught him the wrong lessons. Diane raised him alone after his father left, and she raised him to believe that her happiness was his responsibility, that any need of his own was a kind of betrayal, that the highest form of love was to never, ever disappoint her. By the time I met him, he had been her emotional husband for 20 years. Asking him to choose me over her was not asking him to pick a side. It was asking him to break a law he had been obeying his whole life. Knowing that helped me forgive him for a long time. It is also exactly why nothing ever changed. And I should tell you, so that you understand why I stayed, that Sean was not unkind to me. That was the confusing part, the part that kept me folding for a decade. On an ordinary day, away from his mother, he was the man I married. He brought me coffee in bed on Sundays. He sat with me in the hospital the night my own mother passed and did not let go of my hand until morning. If he had been cruel, I would have left years sooner. It was his gentleness everywhere else that made his silence in that one room so hard to name. You are not being hurt so much as you are being left undefended, again and again, in the one place you most needed him to stand. For 10 years I could not find the words, so I called it normal, and I kept the peace. The years went by, and the small knives did not stay small. They climbed. Year by year they moved from the things outside me toward the things most mine. First she came for my home. The first Christmas in our house, I spent 2 days cooking, the way my own mother had taught me, and I set a table I was proud of. Diane arrived, looked at the spread, and quietly began rearranging it. She moved my grandmother's dishes to the back and put her own out front. She announced that we would be opening gifts at her house instead that evening, because that was tradition, and tradition was non-negotiable. I looked at Sean. He looked at the floor. So we packed up the dinner I had made and ate the good parts cold at his mother's house, where she handed out presents in an order that put me last, after the dog. I laughed about the dog later. to make it a funny story instead of what it was. Everyone laughed with me. That is how you disappear, in case you were wondering. Not all at once. You disappear one funny story at a time, until even you are telling them. And then she came for the one thing I thought even she would leave alone. When we struggled to have a baby, Diane told her church friends it was probably my career, all that standing and stress, very unnatural for a woman. When I finally did get pregnant, she informed me which family names we would be using, and when I gently said we had other ideas, she went silent for 3 weeks and told Sean I had pushed her out of her own grandchild's life. He came to me, exhausted, and asked if I could just give her this one thing. So our daughter carries a middle name I did not choose, for a woman who never once asked what I might have wanted. That was the one that did not fade. A paint color you can paint over. A ruined Christmas you can outlive. But every time I called my daughter by her whole name, I heard Diane sitting in the middle of it, in the one place inside my own child that I was never allowed to choose. That was how far it had climbed in 10 years. From the color of my walls to the center of my daughter's name. That is the thing about a man in the middle. He does not take his mother's side in a single dramatic moment. He takes it in 1,000 small surrenders, each one reasonable on its own, each one asking you to be the bigger person just one more time. And every time you agree, you teach everyone in the room that your comfort is the thing that can always be spent. I noticed I was disappearing. I noticed it the way I notice it in my patients, the ones who have been in pain so long they have stopped describing it, because no one ever did anything when they did. I had stopped telling Sean when his mother hurt me, because telling him only ended one way. He would rub the back of his neck and say, "You two just clash. You're both strong personalities," as if Diane and I were two equal forces in a fair fight, instead of a woman with all the power and a woman who had given up a career, a city, and her own daughter's name to keep the peace. The word he used most was sensitive. "You're so sensitive." "Nora, she doesn't mean it like that. You're reading into it." I started to believe him. That is what a decade of it does. You stop trusting your own read on a room. You start to think that maybe you really are the problem, that maybe a better wife would not feel the sting, that the coldness you feel is something you are generating yourself. I would lie awake replaying a dinner, certain I had overreacted, drafting apologies in my head to a woman who had insulted me in my own home. I started managing myself the way a person manages a chronic illness. Before every family gathering, I would rehearse, deciding in advance which comments I would let go, which I would smooth, how I would steer Diane away from the topics that turned sharp. I had a friend ask me, gently, that year, whether I was happy. And I realized I did not know how to answer her, because I had not asked myself the question in so long. There was one night that started to change things, and it was such a small thing that I almost missed it. Our daughter, who was 5 then, came to me after a visit to her grandmother's and asked me a question. She asked why Grandma was nicer to Daddy than to me. I told her some gentle nothing, the way you do. But after she went to sleep, I sat in the dark and I thought about the fact that a 5-year-old had seen it. A child had read the room correctly in an afternoon, the room I had been telling myself for 10 years that I was imagining. I was not too sensitive. I was the only adult in the family who had agreed to pretend. And I thought about what she had really been asking me. She was not asking about Diane. She was asking, in the way children ask the biggest questions, sideways, why her mother let herself be treated as less. She was watching me, the way children watch, learning what a wife is, what a woman is worth, how much unkindness a person is supposed to swallow with a smile. I had been so focused on surviving each dinner that I had not noticed I was writing her instructions for her whole life. That was the thought I could not put down, Not what Diane was doing to me, what I was teaching my daughter to accept. That was the night I stopped wondering whether it was real and started paying attention to how it actually worked. And once I looked clearly, the pattern was almost simple. Diane was only ever as bold as the room allowed her to be. When I covered for her, she got crueler because there was no cost. When Sean laughed it off, she learned that her behavior was charming. The whole machine ran on one fuel, and the fuel was me. My smoothing, my swallowing, my endless, exhausting work of making sure no one ever had to face what she was doing. I had spent 10 years being the shock absorber in a car that kept driving into walls, and then wondering why I came home bruised. So I made a decision. It was not a dramatic one. I did not plan a confrontation. I did not gather evidence. There was nothing to gather. No secret weapon, no folded paper, no trick. I simply decided that I was done being the reason her cruelty had no consequences. I was going to stop translating her insults into something softer. I was going to stop laughing. I was going to stop jumping into the silence to save everyone from the discomfort of what she had just said. I tested it in small ways first, the way I teach a patient to put weight on a healing leg, a little at a time. At a Sunday dinner, Diane made a comment about how nice it must be for me to have a job where I just help people stretch. The old me would have smiled and made myself small enough to fit under her sentence. The new me said, simply, "It's a doctorate, actually, 7 years of school." And then I said nothing else. I let the fact sit on the table next to the potatoes, and I watched Diane blink, unused to a sentence she could not immediately absorb. It was a small thing, but I felt the ground hold under my foot, and I understood it had been holding all along. I had just been afraid to stand on it. I was going to let her words sit in the air, exactly as she said them, and let the people in the room hear them the way I had been hearing them for 10 years, alone. I knew what that meant. It meant that sooner or later, in front of someone who mattered, Diane would say the thing she always said. And this time, I would not catch it before it hit the ground. It meant I was handing the truth back to the people who had spent a decade refusing to look at it. And it terrified me, because for 10 years, my whole worth in that family had been built on being the one who kept the peace. There were nights I was certain I was about to lose my marriage, that the silence I was no longer filling would swallow the whole thing. I decided I would rather lose it honest than keep it by disappearing. For a while, nothing happened. I just got quieter. When Diane said something with her little smile, I did not rush to fix it. I let a beat pass. I watched Sean notice the beat, watched him glance at me, waiting for me to do my job and make it disappear. And I watched his confusion when I did not. The silences got longer. They got heavier. And in that heaviness, for the first time, the discomfort started to belong to the right people. Then Sean got his promotion. It was a real one, the kind he had worked years for, partner at his firm. They threw a dinner to celebrate, his colleagues, the senior partners, his boss, a man named Richard whose good opinion Sean had chased his entire career. 40 people in a private room at the nicest restaurant in town. And of course, Diane was invited. Because Diane was always invited. Because in Sean's mind, no good thing was real until his mother had blessed it. I want to tell you that I went into that night with a plan. I did not. I went in tired and clear and quietly resolved to do one thing, which was nothing. I was not going to perform. I was not going to manage her. Whatever she said, I was going to let it be hers. Here is the part I am least proud of, and the most honest. The night before that dinner, I almost called the whole thing off in my own head. I almost went back to who I had always been. I lay in bed next to Sean, listening to him breathe, and the old voice came back, the one that sounded like Diane and like every relative who had ever told me to keep the peace. It told me that tomorrow was Sean's night, the biggest of his career, and that if I let his mother embarrass herself in front of his boss, I would be the one who ruined it. Selfish, dramatic, exactly what she always said. The voice told me to do what I had always done, just one more time, one more dinner, and smooth it over for his sake. And I lay there and I almost agreed I had my hand on that old habit like a light switch. It would have been so easy. I got up around 2 a.m. and stood in our daughter's doorway, watching her sleep. I thought about all the things I had folded smaller to keep a peace that had never once been peaceful for me. The Colorado clinic, the city I might have lived in, the name sleeping in front of me, who carried someone else's choice in the middle of her own. I had given all of it away, one reasonable surrender at a time, and I had called it love. What stopped me, in the end, was a memory of my daughter's face when she asked her question. I thought about the lesson she was learning, every single visit, about what a woman is supposed to absorb in silence so that everyone around her can be comfortable. I did not want her to fold a job, a city, and her own name into smaller and smaller pieces for a man who would only look at his shoes. If I smoothed it over one more time, I would not just be doing it to myself, I would be teaching her to do it too. So I made Sean's tie straight the next evening, and I told him I was proud of him, and I meant it. And then I went to that dinner, and I kept my hands in my lap, and I waited. It did not take long. The dinner was lovely, for an hour. Speeches, toasts, Sean glowing in a way I had not seen in years. Richard, his boss, was seated near us, and he was kind, the genuinely curious kind of important person. At one point, he turned to me and asked what I did. I told him I was a physical therapist. I told him a little about the clinic, about the patients, about the work I loved. He listened. He said it sounded like meaningful work, and he meant it. And Diane, who had been watching her son's boss pay attention to me, lifted her wine glass and decided to help. "Oh, Nora's little job is sweet," she said, loud enough for our end of the table. Honestly, Richard, between us, I always hoped Sean would end up with someone with a bit more ambition, a doctor maybe. But she keeps him fed, and she's good with the child, so... She smiled and took a sip. We make do with what they bring home, don't we? 10 years of training told my body to move, to laugh, to wave it off, to say something self-deprecating and warm that would let everyone exhale and pretend she had been joking. I felt the old reflex rise up my spine. My mouth even opened, a little, ready to do its decade-old job, ready to take the hit so no one else would have to feel it. I set down my glass, and I did nothing. I just looked at her, calm, and I let the sentence she had said hang in the air of that beautiful room in front of her son's boss and 40 of his colleagues. I did not defend myself. I did not need to. For the first time in a decade, I was not going to do the work of making her cruelty survivable. I had spent 10 years as the soft landing for every hard thing she threw. That night, I simply stepped aside and let the thing land where she had aimed it. The silence stretched. It was only a few seconds, but I have learned that a few seconds of the right silence can undo years of noise. And in that silence, I watched something I had waited 10 years to see. I watched the room hear her. Richard's face went still, and then carefully polite in the way people are polite when they have just decided something about a person. A woman across the table looked down at her plate. Sean's colleague beside him shifted in his seat. The cruelty I had been swallowing in private for 10 years was finally being tasted by everyone at once. And there was no version of me there to sweeten it. And Sean looked up from his shoes. I had watched him look at the floor for 10 years. Part of me braced for the old move, the nervous laugh, the quiet, "Mom's just being Mom." I had handed him the truth before, in private, 100 times, and he had set it down every time. But there is a difference between hearing a thing from your wife in your kitchen and seeing it reflected on the face of the man who just made you partner. I think for the first time in his life, he saw his mother the way a stranger would, not as the woman whose happiness he was responsible for, but as a person who had just belittled his wife, loudly, on the most important night of his career, in front of the man who had just made him a partner. He saw her reflected in Richard's frozen smile, and he could not unsee it. He put his hand over mine on the table, and then he said, quietly, but loud enough for our end of the room, "Mom, that's my wife you're talking about, and she's the most ambitious person I know. I'd be nowhere without her." He paused, and his voice caught. "I'm sorry I've let you talk about her like that for as long as I have. That's on me." He did not say it to win me back. He said it because he had finally seen it. And once you see it, you cannot say nothing. And I watched it happen to Diane in real time. I watched her understand, in the space of one sentence from her son, that something had just ended that she would never get back. For 30 years, she had been the first voice in his life, the woman no wife could outrank. And in front of his boss, in front of everyone, he had just put his hand over mine and ranked her second. She had spent a decade making me smaller so she could stay the most important woman in his world. And in trying to do it one more time, in the one room where it could not be smoothed over, she had spent the last of it. She did not lose a house. She lost the thing she had been protecting with every cruelty for 10 years. And she knew it. I saw her know it. Diane's face crumpled, then hardened. She said something about how she was only joking, how everyone was so sensitive these days. The word landed on me the way it always had. But this time, it did not stick. Because for the first time, the whole room had watched the joke, and not one person was laughing. She looked around for a friendly face, for someone to fold the moment back into a pleasantry, the way I always had. And there was no one. The job had been mine, and I had set it down. For the first time in 10 years, Diane sat in the silence she had made, and she had to hold it herself. I did not gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. A part of me ached for Diane, even then. A frightened old woman who had built her whole self on being the most important person in her son's life, watching that title slip in real time because she could not stop reaching for it. Her cruelty had never really been about me. It was the sound of someone terrified of being unnecessary. Understanding that did not excuse it, but it let me look at her without hatred, which is its own kind of freedom. We finished the dinner. It was quieter at our end. On the drive home, Sean held the wheel with both hands and did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "How long has it been like that?" And I told him the truth. 10 years. He cried, a little, the way a person cries when a wall they built falls down and they realize they were the one who kept adding bricks. The months after were not a fairy tale. Diane did not transform. People like Diane rarely do. But the machine she ran for 10 years lost its fuel because I stopped pouring myself into it and because Sean finally began to stand next to me in the doorway instead of laughing from the other room. He set boundaries with her, real ones, clumsy at first and then steadier. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen in a straight line. A few weeks after that night, at a Sunday dinner, Diane started testing again. A little comment about how tired I looked, how I should let her help more with the baby since I clearly had my hands full. And I watched Sean's eyes drop, right back down to his shoes. The old reflex, the 20 years of training pulling him under. For a second, the whole decade flashed back, and I felt the familiar weight settle on me. the cue to jump in and smooth it. I did not. I just looked at my husband and waited. And the waiting was its own question. Is this who you are going to be again? He sat with the discomfort for a long, hard moment, his jaw tight. And then he lifted his head and said, "Mom, Nora's doing great. Let's not." It was small, it was clumsy, but he caught himself, and he chose. And that mattered more than the perfect sentence he had managed at the dinner. Anyone can rise once, with a boss watching. It is the ordinary Sunday, with no audience, where a person actually changes. By that spring, he was steadier. There was one evening I keep like a photograph. Diane came for dinner and started in on me about the way I was raising our daughter. Too much freedom, not enough discipline, nothing like how she had raised Sean. The old script would have had me apologizing while Sean studied his plate. Instead, Sean set down his fork and said, "Mom, if you can't speak kindly to Nora in her own home, you can finish dinner at yours." The room went very still. Diane gathered herself up to leave, sure he would fold. Sure I would chase her to the door with apologies the way I always had. Neither of us moved. She got as far as her car, sat in it for 10 minutes, and then came back inside and, for the first time in 10 years, said she was sorry. It was small and stiff, and she never quite met my eyes, but she said it. And she said it because, finally, there was no one left in that house willing to pretend she had nothing to be sorry for. Something else shifted too, something quieter, that I noticed only over months. Diane was no longer the first call. When we had news, Sean told me first. Now, and we decided together what to share and when, instead of everything flowing to his mother before it reached me. At the next holiday, it was our house, and I sat at the head of my own table, and Diane sat where a guest sits, and no one announced it, and no one needed to. The woman who had spent 10 years arranging the room to keep herself at the center of it had quietly been moved to the edge, not by cruelty, not by revenge, but simply because the person who used to keep her there had stopped. Diane and I are not close now. We may never be. But the visits are shorter and the knives are mostly gone, because she finally understands that there is no one in the room who will pretend they did not see them. She says my name now. She thanks me for the meals. Last month, she told our daughter, in front of me, that her mother works very hard helping people. It was not warmth, exactly, but it was the truth, said out loud, and after 10 years, I will take the truth. Sean is a different husband than he was. He still loves his mother, and I would not want a man who didn't. But he no longer loves her at my expense. He learned, late but truly, that standing next to your wife is not a betrayal of the woman who raised you. It is just what it means to be a grown man with a family of his own. We went to counseling, the two of us, that winter. It was his idea, which surprised me more than anything. In one of those sessions, he said something I have kept. He said that for 10 years he thought he was keeping the peace by staying quiet, and that he understood now he had only been keeping the quiet and handing me the war. There is no neutral when someone you love is being belittled. There is only the person who speaks and the person who lets it happen. For 10 years, he had been the second one. He is trying every day to be the first. And my daughter, who is 6 now, will grow up watching a different marriage than the one she almost learned from. She will watch her father straighten his own spine when it matters. She will watch her mother set down her glass and let a cruel thing be heard, instead of swallowing it to keep a false peace. I hope she never has to fold herself smaller for anyone. But if she ever finds herself in a room where someone is being unkind and everyone is waiting for her to make it disappear, I hope she remembers that she is allowed to simply let it sit there and let the truth be heard, and trust the room to finally see what she has seen all along. For 10 years, I thought keeping the peace was the most loving thing I could do. It turns out the most loving thing I ever did was stop. You are not too sensitive for noticing the knife. You are simply the only one who has been brave enough to stop catching it.